Coda 7 of The Map is Indestructible by O.G. Rose. The True Isn't the Rational is a trilogy that often converses with Belonging Again, another series by O.G. Rose, where the topic of global pluralism and a new address are stressed. Global pluralism is a circumstance in which the average person increasingly finds themselves in conflict of mind situations which risk apophenia of seeing what isn't there, like a C word, and yet this Pynchon risk is necessary for philosophy to start. And as O.G. Rose argues, philosophy must be started if we are to handle global pluralism and not regress into self-effacement. Philosophy begins in wonder, or so the classic notion goes, but if this is so, it is at risk. Philosophy begins in wonder at the risk of madness. All right, but by what strategy might we recognize Pynchon risks, basically risks of apophenia and seeing what isn't there? Well, The True Isn't the Rational hopes to outline the strategy. Our world is like a novel which combines Pynchon and Kafka, and we are characters in its fiction. Are we then fictions? Yes, but fictions aren't all false. Regardless, they are arranged. Ideology consists of a system of signifiers over the world, but not of it through which the world is seen. If one variable of the system is changed without ruining the system's internal consistency, if all begin using the word dog to refer to the thing that is a cat, for example, and if everyone begins operating according to this change, it will be as if that variable was always changed. The system will work. Madness? Yes, but also lovely. Errors can be caught. Grace. The movie Pi, directed by Darren Aronofsky, follows the story of Maximilian Cohen, a man dedicated to discovering not things but the pattern behind all things. He believes there is a mathematical sequence that can explain everything in the universe, like the long-sought theory of everything that captures the imaginations of modern physicists. During the movie, Cohen begins to branch out from math and science to find the truth and begins to explore Judaism. When Cohen teacher Sol Robinson hears this, he warns Cohen that if he discards scientific rigor, he will risk madness and become a numerologist instead of a mathematician. Sol warns Cohen throughout the movie that even if there was an ultimate pattern behind reality, humans shouldn't try to know it beyond scientific methods, for this risks the crying of Lot 49-esque madness. The viewer is left to wonder if Sol is a quitter or wise, and the conclusion of the movie invites us to ponder that question afresh. Perhaps there is an ultimate pattern behind everything in the world, but what if it is the case that to know it, we must abandon science? If this is so, which we possibly couldn't know for sure, staying within scientific epistemology, then there is no way to find the truth without possibly becoming like Maximilian Cohen. And isn't it epistemologically immoral not to try to know the truth? To not risk ending up like Cohen? And isn't it the case that in order to know it, the pattern can be known entirely within science? One would have to step out of that methodology, for a time at least, or perhaps we're justified to not venture beyond scientific methods, aware that the risk is paranoia and insanity, like that suffered by Cohen. In the same way, we're justified not to perform certain experiments on people, considering the great suffering it will cause them. It is hard to say, especially considering that scientific methods can't be used exclusively in all areas of life. Perhaps to live is to risk becoming Cohen. Perhaps life is the Pynchon risk. Oh, and what if within the scientific methodology we end up in an identification that Korbowski has made very clear will lead to madness and the loss of sanity? Then we will have to leave. For saving our minds, we will have to risk them. Who in their right minds would do this? No one. Which is perhaps why it could have been no other way than for the problem of identification, a forcing function, to bring us to this point in history described in Belonging Again, this point of potential self-effacement and or childhood that spreads. Section 1. People have known for centuries that Christianity consisted of problems, intellectual gymnastics, and apparent contradictions. But I'm not sure if until pluralism and the loss of givens that people have felt those problems. The histories of society shift when do their feelings. Alluding to compelling by O.G. Rose, it's as if each ideology is a large spear lacking any indentions, and the only way to hold on to one is thanks to a stickiness covering the surface. Once the spear loses stickiness, though, even if our hand is touching the spear, we can't hold it. And even though nothing has changed regarding the validity of the ideology itself, in our grasp of the ideology changing, it feels like everything has changed, causing existential anxiety and a feeling of insecurity. And so then we might be forced to crack the spear open with a hammer of rationality to find a handle inside. And what might we find? A vacuum, a suction, internal consistency, Pynchon's risk, where givens are lost, rationality is unbound, and it cracks open beliefs one by one through history. Only those which are internally consistent survive. But they can survive not necessarily because they are found actual, but because they are found internally consistent, which means they can stand simply because we get sucked into them and unable to deconstruct them, like vacuum traps, like made in abyss, like some inescapable Pynchon scheme. The indestructibility of maps is the inescapability of internal consistency. In a way, givens protected us through and with thoughtlessness from being at risk of falling into these traps, but now we are defenseless. To put this another way, we could say that being thoughtless about Christianity saved us from having to think about Christianity. But now we do find ourselves thinking about it, which could pull us into a map maze that we might infinitely consider and never fully undermine because of Gödel. Furthermore, making our problem worse, maps seem to pluralize, say, in C words where givens are lost, for there are no givens to bind the ever-creation of internally consistent systems. There is no big other by which we can say Whip's maps can't be true, for we need a big other to establish correspondence with reality, and where that is lacking, all we have is coherence for determining the likelihood of correspondence, and coherence seems unbound currently, precisely because only correspondence can bind it. And what is correspondence after Gödel? A situation, true/false. A world of scripts and theoretical awareness like ours is a world where everything feels true/fake, which is to say everything is blurred. A scripted world is a blurred world. In a blurred environment, the hunger and desire for maps to escape that ambiguity, the situation, grows and spreads, especially for maps which can never be undermined or disproven. Thus, the market for C words and internally consistent systems of similar power arises, especially if it can prove a masterpiece of desire. After all, we require maps to function. Why not seek the map that feels most real? Where there are blurs, we are more likely to judge than assess in hopes of keeping out and avoiding the ambiguity. But this is an act which risks causing pathologies, trouble, and self-enclosure. Blurs in scripts are hard to critique and assess, and to conceal us from that difficulty, we will be tempted to judge, transforming our discernment into a hard isness identification versus a tentative assessment that cannot readily make hard claims about the immediate situation. Judgment can better conceal us from the ambiguity, while assessment leaves us far more vulnerable, and yet judgment is dangerous. But once we judge our map as made in the image and likeness of isness, we can then use apocalyptic thinking and the blood of martyrs to make it basically immoral to think beyond our map, which would be silly to think beyond anyways, seeing that it is the case. In our moral space, we can then define and describe the world in a way that reinforces that ethics, become truly ignorant about what is beyond our map to thus make us innocent of not venturing outward, employ game theory dynamics and conversation to maintain our true ignorance and protect our map, and then spend all our time problem solving within our map to keep us busy and feeling good about ourselves. And in this state, we can serve desire and so always be motivated to strengthen and protect our map, happy, having regained meaning and belonging. Until we deal with the problem of maps, we cannot assume the return of meaning and belonging won't be a crisis. Intrinsic motivation is not inherently good. If drive is misdirected in map drive or Pynchon risk for, say, deception, capital D, boredom could be a salvation. However, as discussed in belonging again, without intrinsic motivation, we are also at grave risk personally, economically, socially, politically, and globally. We must play with fire. It's time. How givens and maps deal with drive is different. Givens have us be motivated toward something we don't think about, while maps have us be motivated toward that which we can think about all we like. For essential incompleteness assures they will never be deconstructed regardless. Possibly left, sure, but not deconstructed. In a thought-tormented age like ours, alluding to Joyce, maps will play an ever greater role than givens, but the practical consequences will be similar. Thought will be contained, captured, and even channeled as the zeitgeist would have of us, say according to Capital. And this is us. Section 2. The internet has multiplied and spread maps to an extraordinary degree. See In Infinite Information Over Enough Time by O.G. Rose in The Conflict of Mind. And though maps have always been with us, I think there might be many more of them today than ever before. This is not all bad. It means more people are choosing to live different lifestyles, expressing themselves uniquely, and overall diversity is increasing. A growth of maps seems to follow from the collapse of givens, described in Belonging Again. For if we can no longer gain existential stability from givens, we naturally turn to internally consistent systems to hold us in place somehow. We were once held together and grounded thanks to vertical givens, but without them we require a horizontal structure that seems to give us the same effect. Thus the appeal of indestructible maps and internally consistent systems, that we don't have to worry about being uprooted and deconstructed like givens. Alas, givens worked like and as maps themselves, and so we cannot address the loss of givens with maps. That is to address the problem with a different form of the problem, which is to say it is an indirect return to givenness, which is a nostalgic temptation we must resist at all costs. And that self-effacing return, is a road Belonging Again rejects. Christianity was a given in the West that also generated a map, and the C word has rushed in to fill the loss of givens like Christianity by structuring itself as desire's masterpiece, which means it has the effect of givenness even though we know it isn't transcendent like God. The C word, with its big other of deception, is practically transcendent even though not actually such, which means it practically functions as a return to givens without being so directly. This is why the map, especially in the form of a C word, is so tempting. It seems to be the best way for us to return to givenness, as seems like our only option today, unless we somehow negate sublate the loss of givens into the gaining of gifts. But now we are in Belonging Again, Part 2. A map can be a Schrodinger's conceivability structure and exists in the realm of blurs between truth and falsity, where the map can only be critiqued through a Pynchon Risk which might suck us into madness. This book has argued that theory, script, judgment, and so on are all structurally similar as maps, and so critiquing any of these bring with them the same risks which incentivize us not to bother with them, which by extension risks us falling into passivity, complacency, and ultimately the thoughtlessness which characterizes the banality of evil. This mistake is notably tempting given how the internally consistent system can protect us from outside critique, while at the same time giving us something to capital D, desire. All right, but can't rationality save us from this problem? If desire is trapping us, might we overcome this trap if we were to simply become more rational? Isn't rationality the answer? That seems like a valid approach, but we have a problem. Rationality, especially as autonomous rationality, is a prime reason we suffer the problem of internally consistent systems to begin with. Furthermore, autonomous rationality can ultimately lead us only to a Nash equilibrium, which is to say the most rational and suboptimal of all possible worlds. Another way is needed, but how is that other way known and traveled? By faithful presence, beauty, childhood. Without these, it seems inevitable that some Pynchon Risk gets us some novel story like that of John Titor, as so compelling explored by Mike Sav, as of 2011 when the Civil War was to break out in America. Perhaps it's easy to see that Titor, the time traveler, was a folk legend, but as of 2010, and perhaps there was no Civil War because Titor brought it to our attention, changing the timeline, or because he succeeded in his mission. If John Titor was not a time traveler, then he had access to a broad range of rarefied information spanning several fields of study, knew a great deal about contemporary physics and CERN, and possessed a writer's ability to craft a compelling narrative. John also foresaw many technological changes that would have been difficult to predict in 2001. The John Titor legend is a favorite of mine for considering the problem of internally consistent systems. And my claim is that what we see in this legend vividly is what we are all constantly doing more obliquely. It smells of Sacetone cone in Masamune Shirow. It feels playful and deadly serious, like the best of games, and everything is games, as suggested by Gadamer and James Carse. Could most of John's interlocutors have been plants? Every game seems to end with the same wish. I hope you find what you're looking for was worth the effort. Silence, a suggestion of a good of Heidegger's annihilation and Derrida's deconstruction. The blessings of being able to say, I don't know, and maybe. And is any other defense adequate against the Pynchon Risk but Socrates? What about in a world where a stance must be taken? Can it all be Atlas, Babylon, or does that just mean fiction reflects life? Life, fiction. Saul finishes his book unable to totally dismiss scenario 4. And surely if a C word or a story is too good, It must be discovered instead of created. Yes, that was when I saw the pendulum. The Templars became too powerful, too fast. Section 3. Humans have always been C-word, seemingly because C-words align with how the brain naturally thinks. And as a reminder, I have to say C-word instead of the term because I've had so many issues with YouTube. But to resume. If anything, we have more C-word maps today, which is to say internally consistent systems, but not necessarily C-word notions. I highlight the C-word in this book because they so vividly showcase the problem of maps of our brain. Rob Brothern, in his book Suspicious Minds, makes it clear that C-words are not new, though I would argue that the internet affords new ways they can arise, spread, flexibly save, recreate themselves, and mobilize people, though I could be wrong. Also, C-word theories are not a fringe affair. Huge numbers of people are C-word theorists when it comes to one issue or another. Ambivalence threatens our sense of order, and in a world of ambivalence, we should expect the majority to be C-word, especially when it's not clear what constitutes tidying the desk for us, though I would associate this with childhood, those who play order, quote-unquote. We have innately suspicious minds, and a world without givens is one that begs rational deconstruction in all things and hence suspicion. Despite popular hoopla, it is not the case that there has been an exponential increase over the years in C-word thinking. It has always been with us. However, I would argue we have gotten better at it. We now have the material, thanks to the internet, of making our C-words more indestructible and internally consistent. Even if there is the same relative number of C-words today compared to all prior ages, I'd wager there are more C-word maps than C-word notions. Many C-words are not internally inconsistent today. Many are internally indestructible. There has been an evolution, we might say, and this is partly thanks to the loss of givens, which means C-word thinking is no longer restricted from any resources it might need to make itself indestructible and internally consistent. Everything is at hand, free from, say, taboo, and then at the same time, the very loss of givens creates uncertainty and anxiety, which incentivizes and motivates that very C-word thinking at the same time. C-word now has greater access to resources, and it has greater motivation to formulate itself. C-word has always been with us, yes, but today it might be stronger, creative, and play a sociological role of compensating for the loss of givens in maps. Furthermore, as Hunter describes, C-words give us a deception like God after God's death, whom we can enjoy and ever enjoy anew. Map proliferation doesn't equate with C-word proliferation, even if the two overlap. Map proliferation better aligns with C-word map proliferation, which we can also associate with the Nova effect, or religious options described by Charles Taylor. Brothon gives a strong case for why C-words aren't new, but I do think they now play a unique sociological and even religious war. They are giving people a better sense of belonging. They are giving people a better reason to find one another. This is wonderful in a world that feels alone, but this wonder brings with it a price of atomization, extremism, and self-enclosure. Is there any harm in it, though? Brothon lays out that case too, describing Nazism and other examples to show a strong link between C-word and violence and destruction, suggesting the danger latent in the enterprise. Unfortunately, this problem is not adequately addressed in us just calling C-words crazy. Plenty of journalists are happy to write off C-word theories as self-evidently delusional, perhaps because taking them seriously would lead one to confronting the problem of internally consistent systems, and also because it's more fun to laugh at fools. But this leads us to overconfidence. This leads us into a trap, an obliviousness to the possibilities prowling alongside official stories that we only need to consider for a moment to pull aside into. C-words are staggeringly competent. Chapter 8 of Brothon's book is fascinating in examples and graphics used to explain how humans can see things not there, how we're all suckers for a good coincidence, and how we are masters at misinterpreting something that is there. Consider the Muller-Lyer illusion. Broughton also explores the sociological and collective appeals of C words in helping us feel like we know what the people around us are thinking. Projection is a cornerstone of theory of mind. And in the end, Broughton cannot tell us that C words are always bad or always good. He leaves us with hopes. And I quote, "By shining a light on how our biases can shape our beliefs, my hope isn't to debunk any particular theory, much less to chastate C-word thinking across the board. My hope is that we might scrutinize our intuition, ask ourselves why we think what we think. Are we being prudently paranoid, or are our biases getting the best of us?" End of quote. I appreciate Broughton's approach and encourage everyone to read the book. Zizek can also provide insight into why C-words are so appealing, especially C-word maps, which can function as a capital D deception, an infinite source of enjoyment. Maps channel liaisons, which aligns with givens, and that givens could keep thinking from infringing upon enjoyment through thinking, anxiety, and unclear direction. Where givens are deconstructed, belonging again, our enjoyment is threatened, as evident by the growth and spread of nihilism and confusion. And in C-word, like all maps, we find a way to feel ordered again, and better yet, we feel ordered toward and with enjoyment. We are thereby raising the old Freudian question, why do we enjoy oppression itself? We are speaking of oppression in the spirit of thinkers like Foucault, in that the moment we speak of order, we speak of a restriction on ourselves that limits possibilities. And certainly the world today is aware of norms and all the troubles they bring, and yet trouble is a word that doesn't capture the whole of the issue. We want this trouble. We struggle to enjoy without it, unless we come to be like a child who places a law on ourselves, to allude to Nietzsche. But even this is arguably an oppression. We are not happy when we are totally free. Freedom is ultimately nothing. Nothing is completely free. Every pleasure caught in a symbolic cobweb is branded by a perverted twist, as Zizek says, which suggests that we don't enjoy that which is too directly enjoyable. This becomes boring to us. If we know something is fun, the very certainty can restrict the fun. We will likely need to add alcohol or something, unless we're already thoughtless, say under givens. Enjoyment needs mystery, and if we can't get that, we might sabotage the fun to add to it a sense of fragility that restores the thrill and sense of possibility. And it is a sense of possibility that exists with internal consistency, the perfect structure, which is possible in a C-word map, as it is also present in a religion, strong ideology, and the like. An open circle, we might say, a building with a sunroof, incomplete with the ion in parentheses. And this works because we do not see ourselves seeking fetishes and delusions. We are utilitarian rationalists who know very well that money is just a piece of paper. We are not fools. The truth is out there, as Hex Files puts it. We know the world is constructed, and we experience ourselves with that knowledge, as thus not constructed ourselves. But the key insight of sociology is that social fictions work on us regardless of what we think of them. It doesn't matter if they are fake and we know it. They work. So it goes with C-words. They work on us, giving us belonging, mission, and community, even if they are absurd. And in a world where truth cannot be confirmed, correspondence is incoherence, who can be judged as a fool for risking being absurd? Who knows absurdity from isness anyway? A prideful individual, no? The C-word is humble. He or she risks being judged a fool. And for that courage, the C-word earns his or her belonging, mission, and community. Who dares cast the first stone? Cast and see if the stone kills. The map is indestructible. The subject emerges through alienation, as Zizek stresses, and in a world that demands of us to enjoy under capital, a world where religions have all the answers versus offer us a cross, in a world where everyone is to have perfect mental health thanks to pills, the C-word can offer us an alienation in our social order for which we long, so that we might be subjects at all. We need alienation, but we do not want it, at least not at first. What we need must be earned. A sentiment capital can direct exclusively toward a job we don't want to work, which makes it seem like we are not under the reign of enjoyment. But this is only a tactic to provide plausible deniability to the system of capital and how it works through an injunction to enjoy. We work to enjoy. Work is for enjoyment. Work is not for subjective destitution. Work is not for alienation. Work is for escape, the finding of a path back into Eden. We suffer, but we suffer as a means to an end. Under capital, we do not suffer as an end in itself. Never. We do not trust suffering. We pass suffering by. We do not stop for those on the sides of the road. Seeing disgust as a means, not as an end and good in itself with Illic. Where there is a monopoly on means of alienation, the subject will be linearly formed and formed algebraically, which is to say simplistically versus simply via, say, complexity theory, which we are indeed alienated under capital, but this monopoly on alienation means we are only formed as subjects of capital. We are not formed as subjects of humanity, for example, bringing to mind Carl Hayden Smith. So to be clear, it is not that under capital there is no alienation. The problem is that there is not enough of it, which is to say the diversity of alienation is too limited. Yes, there are countless jobs at which we can be alienated, but all of this alienation is similar in kind. We are alienated by capital. We are doing a job in which we do not find ourselves unless perhaps we own the work. We are alienated by labor, which is a very real alienation, but the subject is more than just this alienation. We are humans, we are fuller, and C words offer to give us more means of alienation and subjectivity. We are hungry for alienation diversity. We want to be fuller. And the C word map is a source of that fullness while providing ever reliable enjoyment under deception. Praise be. Capital alienates us, and if this alienation is sublated into a greater diversity of alienations, it could be a good. Unsublated and limited, capital can lead to flatness that we come to enjoy in its simplicity, as described toward the end of 2.1, belonging again 2.1. But this enjoyment is an enjoyment of understanding that eventually leads to nihilism once we understand too much, as Maurice Blondel taught. We will then need a change found in open systems like C words, in which we never fully exhaust them, and yet also don't find ourselves with nothing to do. Unknown versus unknowable. There will always be enjoyment in what the human does, for we must enjoy, as thinkers like St. Augustine understood. But this is different from saying that the system tells us to enjoy and how. We must find pleasure in something. But if it is not ourselves in our alienation, then we will settle for lower dimensionalities like flatness in capital and cheap knowing. Enjoyment can lead us toward joy and love in Dante, or it can lead us into a world that is thinner than paper, or a world reduced to ash before Lovecraft. That choice is ours. But the choice can only be made well in the midst of a diversity of alienation. This is possible only in suffering, but suffering is good. Consider Hegel's insight into how the absolute always involves self-splitting and is in this sense non-all. This must be replicated in our lives, and it won't do it for ourselves. And if we won't do it for ourselves, capital will do it for us. And why shouldn't it if we won't do the work? Otherness must always be present, which is deeper than just something we don't have. Otherness is ultimately ontological and deep, or it is only a matter of sequence that will eventually be manifest in some possible universe along some eventual timeline, at least theoretically. Otherness must be other in all possible worlds, which means it must be that which is other from me at all points and all configurations. I can never realize it fully, even if I can realize it in part. This constitutes an alienation in relation, not outside relation, which means relation itself is ever constituted by otherness. Is this horrible? It can be, but it also means relation can always be a source of alienation and hence constitutive of the subject, which is to say a source of alienation, diversity, and motivation. This is wonderful, but wonder is both a word of beauty and confusion. We must accept the bothness. We must spin and curve. The fact that God appears in an event which deeply affects God's identity, which is to say in Christianity, God comes to be constituted by a split. The cross is eternal in Christ. So a C word is a split God in the sense that it manifests in its mystery and incompleteness, and yet that split is not a flaw, but an essential constitution that makes space for us to enter and always find a home. Why would we ever leave? Because we identify this home as something we need to kill if we are to fully grow and develop. The C word does indeed offer us alienation diversity, but it does so by entrapping us in an internally consistent system in which otherness is ultimately lost. We become possibly alien to the social order, but we ourselves come to lose otherness to which we can relate. We have comrades and others who think like us, but the other is gone. We are like God, but we are not like Christ. We are not subjectively destituted in ourselves, even if we are rejected by the social order. We know. We have the truth, Gnostic, in the cheap sense. We find ourselves thinking with Eckhart's choice between God and Christ, where God is not good. Christ is life and blood and death. Death is life, or we are enjoying ourselves into a flatness from which we cannot find a way up. For there will be no up. There will be a joke. We must be sustained and produced by love, for psychoanalytical practice is unthinkable without it. For more from The Map is Indestructible, please see the playlist on YouTube, The Map is Indestructible, and please also purchase the book on Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated, and thank you so much for your time.